Okay, so I'm going to talk, and I feel nervous about talking about the health impacts because obviously I'm not somebody who understands much about health. But I will talk a little bit about that and standards that we have for arsenic in various materials. Then I'd like to talk about arsenic uptake and by rice, what we know about that, and toxicity of arsenic to rice. And then lastly, talk about some strategies that could be used to reduce the arsenic toxicity and also to reduce the arsenic content in rice. So I'm going to talk a lot about, sorry. Oops.
Click in N for P.
P.
No,
No, that one.
Yeah, right.
So basically, the units that people in our field use are parts per billion or parts per million and micrograms per kilogram or per liter and milligrams per kilogram or per liter. We tend not to use micromolar or molar methods of expression. So again, I don't really want to say much about the health. Arsenic has many different health impacts, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about lung cancer. I'm just going to use one health impact as a way of assessing the impact that rice might have on that. So anyway, there's a range of impacts. And in water, we have in the U.S. And WHO has the same standard of 10 parts per billion or 10 micrograms per liter for arsenic. And arsenic in water is essentially all inorganic. Depending on the water, it may be mostly arsenate or it may be mostly arsenite or some mixture of the two. So this standard is developed based on intake of 2 liters of water per day. So this would lead then to what I call a maximum allowable daily intake of 20 micrograms of arsenic. So just remember that number because I'm going to use it throughout the talk. So this actual standard is not risk-free in terms of lung cancer or bladder cancer either, and perhaps some of the other health impacts too. So using the FDA dose response model, what you can see is that at the concentration of 1 part per billion, the daily intake is 2 micrograms, and the estimated number of lung cancer cases per million people is 30. Move it up to 10 parts per billion, and that goes to 340. So the risk is not 0. But of course, there's plenty of risks in our lives. And when I first started to work in Bangladesh on arsenic, the WHO people impressed on us, there's plenty of risks that may be more important than arsenic, don't oversell it. And I really appreciate that comment. So here are some risks. And notice we talk about lifetime risk of lung cancer, but basically some of these other risks I've listed here are annual risk rates. And so clearly they're very much higher than the risk associated with arsenic. So risk is a relative thing. What we do about it is sometimes based on facts, sometimes based on policy, sometimes based on emotion. And arsenic is something that stirs emotions negatively, pretty universally. So just bear in mind that there's lots of problems other than just arsenic in our lives, including our diets with high fructose corn syrup.
John, could I just interject?
Yes.
So that's the risk. Just to interject, that's the risk of lung cancer.
Yes.
But we now know that there are many other health
Oh,
outcomes,
absolutely.
particularly the cardiovascular disease
Yes.
outcomes.
Yes.
Just to put it in perspective.
No, absolutely. So I just wanted to pick that one because it's a model that I can use to plug numbers into. The other thing is that we have a standard of 10 parts per billion, but in many developing countries, that the water standard, if they have one, is likely to be 50 parts per billion. Also, if you're in a developing country, a lot of those are tropical, and your intake of water is likely to be higher than 2 liters. So here I've given a couple of options, different levels of arsenic, 10 parts per billion and 50 parts per billion, the Bangladesh standard, and 2 liters and versus 4 liters. And so you can see how the risk for lung cancer increases as we go from 2 liters at 10 to 2 liters at 50 parts per billion. It's slightly higher than a linear model, so a 6-fold increase. And then if we have 4 liters, then it's a 13-fold increase compared to the 2 liters and 10 parts per billion. Now, this is then going up to arsenic intakes of 200 micrograms a day at 50 parts per billion drinking water standard. Now, in Bangladesh, the rural population often gets its water from groundwater, from tube wells, and there's millions of these throughout the country. And this is a map developed from the British Geological Survey and the Bangladesh Department of Public Health and Engineering, showing arsenic levels in the country, in the groundwater. And you can see that in this region of the country here, there's a lot of arsenic in the groundwater, levels higher than 50, up to higher than 400. And this district here that is the most affected is Chandpur district, for those of you that know a bit about Bangladesh geography. So we can go far more than what I showed on that previous graph. We can go far higher. And I do want to emphasize that in many developing countries where if you have this kind of arsenic level in your groundwater and you're using that in a household, then the water is going to overwhelm any other source of arsenic, most likely, in terms of causing health problems. But in reality, our arsenic exposure comes from both water and food. And the arsenic in food is not simply inorganic arsenic like it tends to be in water. It's a mixture of inorganic arsenic and typically methylated arsenic species in cereal crops, or some complex structures in seafood, for example. So all of the standards are based on inorganic arsenic, and because inorganic arsenic is considered to be many times more toxic than any organic form. So in seafood, for example, is where you have the highest levels of arsenic, parts per million levels, milligrams per kilogram. But this is mostly as arsenobutane and arsenocholine, and these are considered to be essentially non-toxic. In rice, basically arsenic is a mixture of inorganic arsenic and organic arsenic with the dimethyl arsenic acid, so just 2 methyl groups stuck on that arsenic molecule in place of hydroxyls. That is the dominant organic form. The distribution between inorganic arsenic and organic arsenic varies widely. Inorganic, maybe 20% to 100%. So organic is obviously anywhere between 0 and 80%. And the levels of arsenic in rice may vary from a low of about 5 parts per billion to 1,000 parts per billion or higher. And this DMA that is in rice is thought really to come from methylation of arsenic in soil by microbes. This can occur both with aerobic organisms and anaerobic organisms with generally much higher methylation in anaerobic environments. But these microbial transformations of arsenic are probably very familiar to you in the health field for human transformations of arsenic. The volatile arsenes are formed, but there's little research on that, and very small amounts seem to be released to the atmosphere. But this is the way that arsenic is methylated and gets into the plant in methyl form. So if you think about the health impact of arsenic in rice, It's going to depend on the speciation, and then of course the inorganic arsenic level within the rice. It's going to depend also on the bioavailability of the inorganic arsenic that is within the rice, because is bioavailability equal to that in water, or is it much reduced maybe because of the plant matrix is different? Well, this is not well studied, and some of the studies that are done are pretty flawed, but the sort of available evidence leads me to think that it's probably fairly high to very high. And certainly we extract inorganic arsenic from rice to measure it in an analytical technique using dilute acid, like 0.1 molar acid. So basically, I think there's a good chance that it's pretty highly bioavailable in humans. And then lastly, it depends on the consumption. So in the United States, our consumption of rice is 29 grams per day. This is not just rice grain as a grain, it's rice grain and all sorts of things, even energy drinks and energy bars and so on. Whereas in Bangladesh, the average adult intake is 470 grams per day, so much, much, much more. Now, recently the UN Codex Commission did set a maximum limit for inorganic arsenic in white rice. This is, so when you take the husk off the rice, you've got brown rice grain, you mill that to remove the external layers from the grain, and you end up with white rice. And this is the form that is mostly consumed in around the world. And they set a standard of 200 parts per billion. This is 20 times the water standard. And China has a standard of 150 for inorganic arsenic. If we take the Codex value and we apply it to these intakes, then what we will find is that in the U.S. you're taking 6 micrograms of arsenic per day, well below the 20 that the water will allow you. Whereas in Bangladesh you're taking actually close to 5 times the arsenic that's permitted essentially by the water standard. So the question is then, why is the Codex standard so high? What is the rationale behind this? And I'm going to put my cynical face on and say it's because they really didn't think about health. They really thought about trade. So what they did in establishing the standard, they collected rice or data on rice, and arsenic data, both inorganic and other species in rice from about 5 or 6 countries, had a meeting, sat around and talked about it and decided parts per billion. So here's the data that came in from Japan. This is inorganic arsenic on the y-axis versus total on the x-axis, and this is the red line here is the one-to-one line. So you can see that Japan, a lot of the rice is pretty much close to one-to-one line, meaning it's essentially inorganic only. But then at these higher levels, there is obviously some organic forms coming in. In contrast, in the United States, the data differs from this one-to-one line almost immediately. So there's high levels of DMA, or the predominant organic form of arsenic in rice from the United States. But you will notice that for both of these countries, there are very few samples above this 0.2 parts per million or 200 parts per billion. And that was true for the other countries. In fact, the Codex said that only 4% of the rice produced in the world would probably not meet this 200 parts per billion standard. So they picked it. And they claim at the same time that this will reduce arsenic intake. I don't get that connection myself. I must say. But rice from different countries does vary a lot in terms of its distribution between inorganic arsenic and organic. So here, this is mostly the Codex data. So for Australia, they only had 36 samples, but of these, here you read this 20% of the samples have 20% or less inorganic arsenic, so 80% would be organic. On the other hand, over here with Japan, 20% of the samples have something like 75% inorganic arsenic within them. So you have to think about this figure a little bit, I know, but basically anything over this side is organic predominantly, anything over here is predominantly inorganic. So rice from Australia, US, and also Thailand has a fair amount of DNA within it, whereas rice from China, Bangladesh, and Japan is predominantly inorganic arsenic, and I think rice from India would also fall in this category. So there are big differences in between countries. And this probably comes back to the cultural practice in rice production. So the other thing that Kodak didn't really consider is how many people eat rice. Roughly half the world's population is the major staple, so 3.4 billion people are predominantly rice eaters, and they're staple food. But how much do they eat? And so when you put all this data together, this is what I came up with, that there's 2.1 billion people consume more than 200 grams of rice per day, and that would contain, at the 200 parts per billion level, where does it go, would be 40 micrograms. There's 1.8 billion consume more than 300 grams of rice per day, and now you're up to 60. There's 167 million, or roughly half the population of the U.S. in the world, that consume rice that would have more than 450 grams per day, and that would, at this 200 ppb level, be 90 micrograms. So these are intake levels that are all above what's allowed for drinking water. One of the things that regulators have done a really poor job with is thinking about total dietary intake. You know, and of course that's complicated because you do have to get into this issue of bioavailability, and that's not an easy thing to do.
Make a comment. There was a blog the other day, and I think it was related to your work, that the concern that people who eat gluten-free diets tend to eat an awful lot of rice, and so they're up at the the right-hand side of that curve, and that's an increasing level of the population.
Yes, absolutely. In general, though, these high rice consumers are really in Asian countries. I'm sorry, this is not in order of consumption. It's alphabetical. But I would like just to briefly mention something about China and India. In these countries, a fraction of the population consumes rice as a major staple, and another fraction consumes wheat as a major staple. So basically, maybe half the population eats rice, half the population eats wheat. So this is an average intake across the whole population. So that's really sort of not a really good way to analyze the data. But it's hard to get disaggregated information. I did find that for China, the intake is 320 grams of rice per day. This is dry rice for 66% of the population that consumes rice. And in India, there is detailed data by state. Mostly in the south, they're rice eaters. Mostly in the north, they're predominantly wheat eaters. So this needs to be analyzed more completely than I've done here. So what happens if we put rice together with water in terms of lung cancer risk? So what is shown here is that same figure again, essentially. Over here, I've got 10 parts per billion of arsenic standard and 2 liters and 4 liters. The 50 parts per billion, 2 liters and 4 liters. And then the black dashed lines represent the arsenic intake, where you have 2 liters of water, 250 grams of rice. So this is not at the highest level. Well, I was taking sort of data from Bangladesh where we would have 200 parts per billion as a sort of a lowish level in rice sometimes, and 80% would be inorganic arsenic. So that's where the 160 came from. And then here with 4 liters of water plus 500 grams, so this that high intake of rice, and now the rice containing 400 parts per billion, 320 of which is inorganic. So you can see that it clearly shifts up the curve, and at this point here, this is getting close to 1% of the population. Now, there are assumptions in doing this, obviously. The first one is I've assumed 100% bioavailability of inorganic arsenic in rice. But so this is worst case scenario. And for Bangladesh, then, intakes of rice at these levels would increase cancer incidence by 1.5 to 1.9 times. Now, in the U.S., to give you another sort of context, well, let me start by saying that if you have a cup of dry rice, it probably weighs 180 grams. Somewhere between 170 and 200, depending on the variety. So, and if you consume 1 cup of cooked rice every day, which for a U.S. national would probably be a lot, in terms of frequency anyway, and that contained 100 parts per billion inorganic arsenic. And that is what U.S. rice on average contains, and the standard deviation on that number is fairly low. So if you ate U.S. rice 1 cup per day, you would increase your cancer risk from 340 to 520, which is not a lot, to give you a perspective. So it's much, much less than obviously would happen in Bangladesh at this point. Okay, so let me talk about arsenic uptake and movement into rice, and I don't really want to talk about all of this because it would take me a bit too long, I think. But basically, in terms of uptake, things that go on in the root are shown in this sort of deep red color here. So uptake of inorganic arsenic is much, much greater than uptake of either the monomethyl or the dimethyl forms into the root. Arsenic 5, inorganic arsenic 5 uses the phosphate transport system. This is competitive with phosphate. Arsenic 3 is taken up through the silicate transport system using the LSI-1 transporter, and this is through aquaporin channels that take up sort of neutral molecules. Arsenic 3 is generally neutral at most pHs. And this is non-competitive, however. Now, when arsenic gets in the plant, if it's arsenic 5, the rice immediately reduces it to arsenic 3 in the root. And all of the inorganic arsenic that is transported within the plant seems to be arsenic 3 species, not arsenic 5. Also within the root, arsenic 3 can complex with sulfhydryl groups. They are put glutathione here, but it could be other kinds of molecules also with sulfhydryl groups. And these can be precipitated and stored within cells, so they can be potentially immobilized within the root.
Any thoughts about why the plant does that reduction from 5 to 3?
Well, I mean, it makes sense because you can't form these sulfhydryl complexes with arsenic. Right. So, but you know, that's thinking. Sure. But I don't know. It's free. Yeah. Right. And then transport of arsenite out of the root system is through a silica transport of the LSI-2. So outer cells that eventually get into the xylem and go into the top of the plant, that is competitive with silica, that stage. Now, one of the other things we know is that DMA gets in the rice more slowly into the root, and once it's in the root, it moves to the top really quickly. And it once it's in the top, you get to the reproductive phase, the DMA moves rapidly into the grain, to the developing grain. And I'll show you later it can be toxic to that developing grain. So it moves much more easily within the plant than inorganic arsenic. And again, there's places where nodes where arsenic is partitioned between leaves and stems. And again, in these places, we can form these sulfhydryl complexes within the tissues. And just to show you some evidence from that, this is using nanosims is a technique where you're removing ions from the surface of a material and you're mapping it, and you analyze it by mass spectrometry, so you can now analyze lots of different elements simultaneously. So this is the carbon-nitrogen map, and you see various cells and various sort of spaces. These things that are labeled ST, these are called sieve tubes, and it's through these in the phloem vascular system that elements and other materials move into the grain. So those sieve tubes then are really important to everything that gets into the grain. And they're surrounded by these CC cells. They're called companion cells. Good name. But what you see is that sulfur and arsenic both are concentrated in these companion cells. And there's an extremely strong correlation between the two that quantitatively matches what you would expect the formation of these thiol complexes. So this is not proof, but it's strong supporting evidence for immobilization of arsenic within the top of the plant. When we look at overall at the distribution of arsenic within a plant, if this plant is being fed inorganic arsenic, only a very small fraction of the arsenic that gets in the plant ends up in the grain, 3%. Most of it is distributed between the top of the plant, the straw, and then also the husk that surrounds the grain and the root. In contrast with DMA, people have not really looked much at the root. There's some limited data that indicates it's really pretty low. And data that we have from various rice plants shows that DMA, half of it is in the top of the plant or in the leaves and the stems and the husk, and then half is in the brown rice itself. So you get a lot more DMA movement, as I mentioned before, into the grain itself. So that's what we know about, more or less. I'll let a few things out about movement of arsenic in rice. Now, it's been known for quite a while that arsenic is toxic to rice. This is work done in Louisiana, actually, back in '92. And this is a hydroponic experiment where rice is grown in solution culture. And you can see, with different forms, you can see that both arsenite and monomethyl arsenic acid are quite toxic to the rice. You need numbers to know that. In the same experiment, they also had DMA and arsenate, neither of which impacted the biomass production of rice. However, this experiment was not carried forward to grain production. And more recently, a publication has shown that DMA will form abnormal florets on the rice panicle, on the grain itself, and that the seed setting rate is much reduced when you have DMA. So this is showing then that DMA is toxic, but maybe in a different way than arsenite and MMA are toxic. And this hasn't all obviously been sorted out really in detail yet. This is in Bangladesh, and I'll talk pretty much about Bangladesh from now on, I think. And this is a conventional rice paddy, continually flooded, where it's in an arsenic-affected field, and you can see it's not growing very well. Over here on the right, we've been using these raised beds, which use less water, make it maybe a bit more aerobic, so arsenic is a little less reduced, so arsenic may be less available. You can see the plants are growing fine in this thing, and I'll come back to that later. But this is what arsenic toxicity sort of looks like in fields in Bangladesh. This is a fairly severe case. So arsenic doesn't impact rice yield. This is work that we did on a farm or field across an arsenic gradient. It was actually created by use of irrigation water that contained arsenic. And the arsenic deposition, for various reasons, is not uniform. It often forms gradients. So basically, what you can see in 3 successive years with winter season rice, with their main rice variety that's grown in that season, you can see that grain yield was reduced with increasing soil arsenic. Our lowest value was about 10 ppm, and our highest was about 60. We don't know what happens between 0 and 10. But 10 ppm is not a really high level of arsenic in the soil. And it also impacted the arsenic uptake, was increased. This is showing straw. It's a bit more complicated with grain because of toxicity, but basically what's in the straw is often related to what's in the grain, not always. So it can be both toxic and it can increase the uptake of arsenic by the plant. Okay, so then let me talk about strategies to reduce arsenic toxicity and arsenic content in the grain. So I've got 4 here. I'm not going to talk about them all. Low arsenic irrigation water, I'll talk a little bit about. Crop management, we've got various strategies. Rice processing and actually rice preparation in the whole in the cooking process can affect it. And of course, you can have policy level decisions that organize where rice is grown within the country. But those are obviously hard to achieve. So this is a map. We mapped well, what we determined in earlier studies was that the southern half of Bangladesh is where most of the soil arsenic contamination is and where most of the groundwater arsenic contamination is. And that was, the water was established by BGS DPHE. This is irrigation water now, so this is agricultural wells, not household wells that the BGS use. And you can see we analyzed 70 and 102, I believe it was, in those points. And this is our map then of water arsenic. And you can see that less than 50 parts per billion is sort of the minority on this map. And there's a wedge down through here, some up here, and a little bit over around here. But a lot of this central area that's sort of south of Dhaka is high, and some of it's more than 200 parts per billion. So finding low arsenic irrigation water is not going to be easy. In this area here, we didn't map down in here in this Barishal division because the irrigation of rice in this area is with surface water, and there's not an issue with arsenic in that. Can surface water be extended? Maybe. If we can grow rice with less water, maybe we can help even more. Things like that. But it's a challenge to find low irrigation, low arsenic in irrigation water. And this is showing the impact of irrigation water on soil arsenic. And we have soil data along with that irrigation water data. And so I've done this by various districts, and I've pulled all the data. And so if the irrigation water is in these different classes, this is the mean soil arsenic value on this axis here. And you can see that in all of these places, these different districts, it does in fact, soil arsenic increases with increasing arsenic in the irrigation water, particularly in Dakar and Maniganj, two districts that are close. Well, Dakar is where the capital is, and Maniganj is next to Dakar. And here's this 10 parts per million level, above which we see toxicity rise. So this then is potentially a problem.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
What was the basis for subdividing the various areas?
Could you repeat the question so people?
Yeah. So the question was there a basis for combining these different districts or not? And basically, they are in sort of different, for the most part, in different regions. So the top group, Kushti, Mirpur, Churangi, Janaya, Jeshur, Shakir, are all western border districts. And, you know, Brown, Barrier, and Camilla are next to each other. Then Gobelganj, Kula, Magura, and Araya are in that sort of south central area. Madarimpur I kept separate because it's got the highest level of soil arsenic. And Chandpur, Munshiganj, and Shariatpur are sort of close-ish. So it's sort of more, it's sort of geographical, I guess would be the way to say that.
But it's not obvious why Dakar, Maniganj.
No, and why they would go up so fast. I mean, it could be that the wells are much older there, and it's been going on for a lot longer time, and that's because, you know, maybe they started putting wells in near the capital. I don't know, although we have the well data. So we can, though, take various crop management approaches. And the first one that most farmers would like would be to have varieties that are tolerant to arsenic. And there is some difference among the existing varieties in terms of their tolerance to arsenic. So here's Viridon 47 versus Viridon 45, and these levels of arsenic in the soil. This is surface soil put in a pot, a big pot, and grown, the rice was grown flooded. And you can see that it doesn't really affect Viridon 47 much, at least in terms of the biomass, but it has a huge impact on Viridon 45, and this highest level is virtually no plant and no grain at all. And so this, for the winter season rice varieties, which are the ones that are irrigated with groundwater, and it's actually the fact that Bangladesh allowed that to develop that enabled them to become self-sufficient in food, at least in rice. Before that, they were among the worst in terms of famine of the world's countries. So basically, all of these different varieties lose yield to some extent above about 10 parts per billion, which is per million in the soil. This is field-grown rice, so it's in the field, so it's the actual field's arsenic profile. And you can see that they're all going down. You can see also that this is BR36, that is stable up to maybe 30 parts per million soil arsenic, then it drops off after that. But you can see there are differences. So varietal selection is a choice. I put this map, this is the soils map. It's very different than the water map, but that doesn't really matter for us today. And you can see that there are those areas within the red circles are where the higher soil arsenic levels are found, and you can see that 10 to 15 is this color here. So anything that's this color darker, which is quite a lot in these areas, is going to be toxic to most rice varieties. And this was the actual distribution of all of the samples. 42% had more than 10 parts per million, and 16% had more than 20 parts per million. So this is not a theoretical issue, it's actually a practical issue that is happening already within Bangladesh. For summer season rices, we have similar data. You can see they're also sensitive. This was done in a pot experiment, the big pots again, but with surface soil that was low in arsenic, and then arsenic was added as an inorganic salt. And so that probably is more available than the natural system. And so we shouldn't necessarily expect that these big drops here are I think they're exaggerating it, but what they do tell us is the relative tolerance of different varieties. And so I've ranked them here, and you can see that the yield equation for here, for Viridon 47, the yield is 30, which is the yield without arsenic, minus 0.11 times the soil arsenic level. At the other end of the spectrum, for VR22, the yield is 48.2 minus 2.59 times the soil arsenic. So there's a big range in tolerance. So this information can be used, well, it needs to be verified in a lot of different environments, and it can be utilized by farmers. Now, different varieties also take up different amounts of arsenic. So this is showing arsenic in the rice grain. And it's showing it for the two main rice seasons, the borer rice, which is the winter rice, and the tea almond, which is the summer monsoon rice. So in the borer season, there were 23 varieties. I'm only showing data from 4. There were 10 regional stations. So all these varieties were grown at 10 different ecological regions of Bangladesh. And what I'm showing is, on the figure, is the deviation from the overall mean. So for the borer season, the mean is 329 parts per billion in the grain. And so I'm only showing varieties where the variation is greater than 10%. So most of the borer varieties were very close to the mean. These are ones that deviated a little bit more. And you can see 3 of them were higher. This is Viridon 47. That actually is, so the mean is the 0 here, and Viridon 47 is minus 100 from the mean, so it's 229 parts per billion. So that's quite a big difference. And then here in the monsoon season, there were 27 varieties, only 5 regional stations, and rice was much more variable. And so here I'm showing greater than a 20% variation from the overall mean. And you can see there's I think 15 or 16 varieties here. The first thing to point out, though, is the mean here, where the rice is irrigated with water from the wells, is 329, and down here in the monsoon season is 140. So you can see that there are some varieties, again, where the arsenic is lower, some where it's higher, and particularly worrisome actually are these two. And the reason for that is that these are fairly newly released varieties that are drought tolerant. And of course, they're not grown under drought conditions in this experiment. But basically, you can see they take up a lot more arsenic than the older varieties. So the oldest variety here is 5, the lowest number. These are the numbers from the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute system. So 57, 56 are newly released compared to all these down here.
But yes, the drought resistant ones are no worse than the mean borer.
No.
Right.
But you don't want to move in this direction, because here you've gone plus almost 170 higher than the mean.
Sure.
So you've got up to 309, right? But why go from 140, or some of these look 74, 88, 62? So we should be striving for this level rather than this level. And the breed, again, the breeders to think about this is really difficult.
I was going to ask, what is the Institute thinking about the rice problem? It's yield and not.
Right. I mean, so the question was, what is the Bangladesh Rice Institute's thinking about the rice problem? Well, it is pretty much yield, and that is, of course, affected by various stresses, both biotic and abiotic. So the main effort is often on the biotic stresses, and in the abiotics, it's salt tolerance and it's drought tolerance. We instituted a breeding program in the Institute for arsenic. They did a very nice job. They are not, our program is finished. They are only continuing it informally at this point. So, but this is a big mistake, you know, I mean, it doesn't make sense to do this, right? So, and there's a lot of inertia in making changes in the way that people think about this. So, if you grow rice with less water, you get less arsenic because the availability of arsenic in the soil is lower. These are various approaches for that, and I'll quickly show you some of these. So with a raised bed, this is the experiment that we did here. This is showing straw arsenic and grain arsenic in two varieties, one that is somewhat vulnerable, one that's the most tolerant one. And you can see with conventional flooding, continuous flooding versus alternate wetting and drying, which is basically flooding the soil to about 10 centimeters depth, letting it drain till the water table is 15 centimeters below the surface. So that's when it gets aerated somewhat, and then reflooding it, and going through the cycles of flooding and draining. And the raised bed is what I showed you in that picture, and this is also the water in the bed in the furrow can go up and down, obviously. And you see that these reduce arsenic in the straw a lot. They going from 7 years to about 2 or less. And here in the grain, you can see also reducing it, but not as big a reduction in the grain proportionally as we have in the straw. And we do, though, impact yield in general, showing you the conventional versus the bed here, and the conventional here and the bed here. This slide, I just wanted to highlight, this is a relationship for arsenic in straw versus that in grain. And all of these blue diamonds are rice grown conventionally, and the magenta squares are on the raised bed. There are 6 varieties. The data is all combined. You can clearly see that it goes down, but what you do notice is that over there's a 9-fold decrease in straw arsenic from 9 to 1 here, and only a 2-fold increase from about 0.4 to about 0.2 for the grain. So to get low arsenic in rice, you have to have no arsenic almost in the plant, is the message to take from this. And that's difficult. But guess what? These guys in Italy, in Sardinia, actually did this. So they worked a long time to try and grow rice with sprinkler irrigation, like we would do in growing crops in the Midwest, for example. And they worked a lot to not reduce the yield of rice, because typically when you use less water, you run the risk of getting lower yields because of drought issues. And rice is very sensitive to that. So this is their field early on. This is it later, close to maturity. This was in the flooded condition. The average arsenic in the grain was 163, and in the sprinkler it was 2.8. That's almost below detection limits for analysis methods. So this obviously works, but sprinkler irrigation is high-tech, expensive. Here's a farmer in New Jersey that we learned about near Princeton. To keep it in the Ivy League. He has an organic farm. He grows rice with drip irrigation, which is usually used for vegetables, so it's the most expensive form of irrigation in general, and also the most efficient. And we analyzed inorganic arsenic in 5 varieties. 4 of them were between 14 and 18 parts per billion, and 1 was 35. A substantial reduction again. So it can be done, but can this be practical on a large scale across the developing world? That's the question. We looked at rice processing. First, milling. We asked 3 questions. So you can look at the graphs, but what I've got written here is maybe enough. So how much arsenic is removed with progressive milling? So removing 5% of the mass, 10%, or 15%. And the answer was 15, 30, and 45% of the total arsenic was removed. Does arsenic removal vary with the level of arsenic in brown rice? And the answer is no. So it doesn't matter what the level you start with, whether it's up here or down here, you're removing the same proportion. And basically, here's the data that supports that, these figures here. Then the third question was, does arsenic removal vary with variety? And for Bangladesh varieties, the answer again is no. So we milled 27 month summer season varieties and 23 winter season from one site, and we had 10% mass loss. And this is the relationship between brown rice and white rice. And you can see it's about 29%, 27% removal. So you can see that it's very, very consistent. So we could then translate this into saying, well, if you mill this much, you'll get this much out. But it's proportional to what you started with always. But milling preferentially removes inorganic arsenic. And that's because the inorganic arsenic is on the very exterior of the grain, and the DMA can diffuse more into the whole part of the grain. So you preferentially remove inorganic arsenic, which is good. If you cook rice in excess water, you can also remove arsenic. And this is some work done by some Japanese, I think, in Bangladesh. And basically, so this is the initial level of arsenic in these rices. So let's just concentrate on this green one, the VR28. So if you cook that in, well, if you wash it maybe 5 times till the water is clear, and then cook it in 5 to 6 times the volume of water to the volume of arsenic, you can see that the arsenic in the rice drops dramatically. The problem with this is that if you have arsenic in the water above a certain level, above this level here, you see that you increase the arsenic in the rice by cooking this way. So you need to understand the level of arsenic in your rice and the level of arsenic in your water, which is obviously, maybe you could do the latter, but maybe not the former. So that's going to be difficult.
You have a question from the web. Does cooking remove inorganic arsenic or DMA or both?
I think it would probably remove both, but again, I think preferentially inorganic. I'm not absolutely sure about that.
It wasn't measured in this experiment.
No, this is just total. And I decided, well, you know, getting an American housewife to cook, well, I tried this. You cook rice in excess water, it's a mess. So I was trying to think of an easier way. So I thought that, well, we can do the washing part. And then why don't we just, after we wash 5 times, put water back in the container with the rice and let it soak. So you do this in the morning before you go to work. When you come back, you decant the water, rinse it once, and then cook it. So what effect will that have? So this is basically washing 5 times and then soaking for 8 hours. And these are various rices I bought in the supermarket in Ithaca. And you can see that the original levels are in this red color, the blue is after washing and soaking. You can see substantial reductions in arsenic. Average 49% with a range from 35 to 79%. With brown rice, you can see that in general, the reductions are much more modest. And in this one, the rice actually is almost hydrophobic when you put it in, but by the end of the day, it's absorbed the water and it's blown the rice grain up. So the water, I think, gets access to the interior. So basically, this would work with white rice, but not really very well with brown rice. Most people eat white rice, but people who are gluten intolerant often like brown rice. So anyway, the mean yield was 14, and the range was from 5 to 43%. So if you took rice that had 200 parts per billion in the brown rice, that's the Codex standard for white rice, not brown rice, but let's just use that number. Milling at 10% mass loss, 30% removal, goes down to 140 in white rice. If we wash with arsenic-free water, you can remove about 10% of the arsenic. This is 5 or 6 washings. And so it goes from 140 down to 126. If you cook with excess arsenic-free water, or you soak in arsenic-free water for 8 hours, you can remove a further. This is 23%. This is the low end of the range. So it could be better than that. But you would go from then 126 down to 95. So you can get less than half the original level through this processing and preparation steps. So in conclusion, I mean, arsenic does in rice pose a significant health threat to people who consume rice as their major staple food. However, in the context of their environments, it may not be the most important health issue to concentrate on. Just bear that in mind. The Codex limit is too high, and regulators in general need to consider intakes from diets, not just single sources, when setting limits or standards. In the U.S., you take, in the average U.S. diet, your greatest intake of arsenic is from what? Vegetables. What's number 2? Fruits and juices. Oh boy, we're in trouble. What's number 3? Oh, right. What's number 4? Beer and wine. We're back in trouble again. So basically, it's important to consider the whole dietary intake. In the U.S. diet, the intake may not be sufficient to cause problems, but it probably is in some young babies and infants, which have a higher proportion from the food than from the water. So anyway, we do definitely need to move from just setting a standard for a particular product. But there are options to reduce inorganic arsenic in rice through varietal choices, through various management strategies, and through rice processing and preparation. So if we put all these together, we can do a lot to help. I don't think there'll ever be one single solution, although genetics may prove me wrong. If you're worried about arsenic in rice, buy white rice, aromatic white rice that comes from India, Pakistan, or California. And this will have the lowest inorganic arsenic levels. And this consumer's report from the update from 2014 has some pretty reasonable recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Some more questions. Let's try to use the mic.
What is known about the conversion from the methylated forms back to the inorganic forms, both in nature and in cells?
Well, in soils, the reason, well, in the southern United States, monomethyl arsenic acid and DMA both were applied to cotton as to control the bollworm. And later, some of them were used as desiccants. And so basically, these organic forms have been added to soils in the south that used to grow cotton, which now, some at least, are growing rice. And so they're elevated in arsenic. So the researchers there have always done experiments where they added the monomethyl arsenic acid to the soil. What actually happens is that the microbes in the soil will demethylate. and maybe not right away, but over time, and as you go, I mean, when it's flooded, it maybe stays in the monomethyl form. or maybe goes to DMA more likely. And when it's drained after the rice is harvested, then it may get demethylated back to inorganic arsenic. And that does seem to be what happens in soils.
Does that happen in plants?
We thought initially that perhaps plants could methylate, and we raised that as a hypothesis that got shot down in flames pretty well, I don't know, pretty much. So there's weak evidence that some plants under certain kinds of stresses might be able to methylate, but it's not been documented in rice so far. But maybe this is something that could also be a strategy. This would be a transgenic plant, of course.
Another question from the webinar, is DMA in rice tri or pentavalent?
Well, it's pentavalent.
So a practical question. So you bring rice from abroad to Ithaca. How do you get through customs? That's an issue for us.
God, I suspect it. So you well, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer, but obviously you can have standards, but you also have to have enforcement. And whether it's being enforced or not, I have no idea.
But seriously, do you bring rice right through parcel through customs and without any trouble? Don't you have to check the box that you're bringing food in?
Oh, well, for me or for somebody who's selling rice. I mean, if you're a commercial...
Bringing it into the laboratory.
Well, if you bring it to the laboratory, you have to have a permit. Yeah. It's pretty straightforward.
And you have such a permit?
I have a permit, right.
Yeah, that's all.
It's easy to get. You get in a day, well, a week.
Oh, really?
It's not, they're not so good at checking it on it.
And I always thought with them is that a lot of your analysis is actually conducted in Bangladesh, so you haven't had to import that much rice yourself recently, I think, is that right?
Well, right now we're importing rice from 5 to 6 different countries.
Okay.
So, and it's pretty straightforward. So basically what is supposed to happen, you have the permit, of course people can send this to us, and when it comes, and they have to declare what's in it, obviously, and then when it comes on the FedEx shipment, they're supposed at the port of entry to turn it over to the USDA. Yeah. They inspect it there, or they used to send it to Beltsville all the time, but they should apparently now inspect it in some other places. If it looks good, they'll release it. So what they look for is evidence of any pests in it, any disease.
It's a procedure. We have the same for soil. It just takes time.
Right.
They open the package? They open the package, the samples there where the rice is, like tubes and
of course, they absolutely, they should do that. Last time I came through, it was a new system, and I was through before I realized, and I had rice down on it, and I had the permit and everything, and I walked through, and they never looked at it at all.
John, if you were asked by the Bangladesh government, and not just by the Ministry of Agriculture, what your advice is on in terms of lowering exposure, how would you present the water versus rice issue? How would you balance those two?
Oh, I'd say absolutely you have to concentrate on the water, especially in places where the water is high. And the impact of that should be many, many times higher than the rice. However, if you're in the northern part of Bangladesh where the water is low in arsenic, well, then maybe rice would, in those circumstances, contribute much more to health issues associated with arsenic, to the extent they occur. But I would not, you have to concentrate on the most important issue in the place that you're working, and that can vary, of course, over countries. But I would not, I don't worry about eating rice when I go to Bangladesh, do you?
Well, we don't eat 450 grams.
True.
Other questions for John? Yeah, well, thank you very much again.